What's up, guys, and welcome back to Gabe at Miller Music. Today I'm going to be comparing two immensely powerful budget groove boxes, the Roland MC-101 and the newly released Novation Circuit Rhythm. I promised this a while back, and I'm following through on that now. It's an interesting comparison to make because these have some overlapping abilities, in fact, a surprising amount of them, and a bunch that makes them quite unique from each other. So, all that being said, let's get into it. Let's start off with the super obvious similarities. Both of these are completely self-contained, super portable, battery-powered music production devices. This one is a bit chunkier in terms of its depth, but it's got a pretty compact footprint, whereas this one has a larger footprint and is super slim and sleek. Both of these have the capabilities of storing samples on the SD cards, but in a bit of a different way. And you can use those samples to build up songs, either by playing them as one-shots, chopping them up, or mapping them to a keyboard. We've even got some similarities like grid effects, which is a new addition to the Circuit Rhythm. Circuits haven't had grid effects before this, and holding down these grid effects will mess up your sound in different ways. There are some key differences though, and I'll get into those in a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time focusing on the interface. It'll crop up from time to time, but I've already done a video comparing the Novation Circuit tracks to the MC-101, and I don't want to retread too much of that material. But to retread some of that material, I would give the Circuit Rhythm the win for user interface design. This is one of the best devices in the game right now for fast, intuitive music production, especially for a standalone device and especially for a device without a screen. And in this case, it works to the device's advantage. And in fact, both the Circuit Rhythm and the MC-101 do take a pads are the screen approach a good chunk of the time. Where you're going to use the screen on this is selecting samples and then modifying their parameters. You've got macro knobs to modify samples parameters on here. For instance, you've got the distortion module, the length, the slope, which is just an envelope essentially, filters. Whereas on here, to get to that stuff, you do have to menu dive a bit. So you'd hit Shift, go to Sound. This is not meant to be an in-depth tutorial, but I just want to show you how you navigate this. And then you can scroll through the tons of parameters you have to edit. So the advantage of having a screen is that you can deal with more parameters. The advantage of having more limited parameters, as long as they're carefully selected, is that you can often get into the music making process much faster. And Roland is kind of notorious for a somewhat janky, slightly antiquated menu-divey workflow. They've made a lot of improvements to this and have added a lot of shortcuts that make working on this thing a lot faster than a lot of people realize. So I'm not going to say this completely blows this out of the water, but overall, I would say the Circuit Rhythm is faster to use, more immediate, and more intuitive than the MC-101. And those of you who have watched the channel for a while and know my feelings on the MC-101 and the other circuits probably aren't all that surprised by that. But let's get into the main thing that I really wanted to compare in this video, which is how these devices handle sound. Because there's some overlap, and then from there, they diverge quite a bit. And this is a really interesting microcosm of what musical instrument designers choose to include and not include. Because for the circuit, you've got more tracks. You've got 8 total tracks to work with, which sounds positively luxurious compared to the Roland MC-101's 4 tracks, but those come with some important trade-offs. For one thing, tracks on the Circuit Rhythm are monophonic, so you can only play one sound at a time on each track, although you can switch between multiple sounds, like this. So if I was to program that in, just put in something random, quantized it quite nicely. That all lives on one track, so you can see how that can get pretty powerful pretty quickly. It's a bit of a limitation to not be able to play chords or not have notes bleed into each other. It's pretty unfortunate that this can't do it, but in practice, I basically never notice it. Once I got used to it, which was pretty much immediately, I was able to just adapt my music making process for it. I barely notice it anymore. And for the packs that I've made, I've done stuff like load in some chords that can be pitched around fairly seamlessly, and I have a version with some banks of chords that I can switch between as well. Also, on the Circuit Rhythm, Every single track is exactly the same. They have all the same parameters to control. They all handle samples in exactly the same way. They're completely identical in every way. Because of that, each track on the Circuit Rhythm is designed to be fairly flexible, and that gives you a good bit of versatility, but that also does lock you into a specific way of working with sounds. That's not the case with the MC-101. You've got a few different ways you can work with sounds. First of all, you have kits, which live on one track. And that's a bunch of samples all laid out as one-shots. And you'll notice I'm playing multiple samples at once. That is how kits work. So you're not going to be able to separate this into separate tracks. That'll all just live on, in this case, track 1. But that means that you can just load this thing up with one-shots and still have 3 tracks free. So the 4 tracks isn't nearly as limiting as you'd think. There are also tone tracks, and these are equivalent to mapping a sample to the keyboard on the Circuit Rhythm. So let me quickly show you that. I've got this sample. I hit note. I've mapped that to the keyboard. Super straightforward. That's new to the circuit line, which is really nice to finally have. This can also do the exact same thing. You go to a tone track, which is their synth tracks, and I'll get into the synth aspect of that in a second. I can choose to load up a WAV file. That lives on this track as well. And this is polyphonic. So I can hold down multiple notes at once. No problem. Which, once again, I can't do on here, which is unfortunate. Not a huge deal, but it does depend on how you like to work. And this came out before this, which does make me go, could they have pulled that off on here? I am not a computer engineer, I'm a civil engineer, so I unfortunately don't know, but that's just how these devices are. Also, sounds on the MC-101 are stereo. So if you load in a stereo sound, it'll retain that. Not the case on the Circuit Rhythm. It'll collapse the sound down to mono. And I should note, you can't actually hear that because I've just got mono outs running from each device, but this will retain the stereo-ness of a sound. The Circuit Rhythm will not. You can give a sound some stereo width on the Circuit Rhythm by giving it some reverb or delay, but it will take a stereo sound and collapse it down. So you do sacrifice a little bit of sound quality with the Circuit Rhythm, whereas on the MC-101, it tends to leave samples fairly intact as far as quality goes. One other sample-specific thing that the MC-101 does have over the Circuit Rhythm is the fact that these samples can behave a little bit more like synths than samples can on the Rhythm. Because if I go into edit my sound, or my tone, as it's called, I can do stuff like turn on portamento. And unfortunately, there is no portamento option on the Circuit Rhythm. That's not necessarily going to be a huge deal, but it is really nice to have. And you can also add stuff like vibrato and all that kind of stuff on the MC-101 as well. It treats these samples like synths. And the Circuit Rhythm treats samples like samples, if that makes sense. Even when you map it to a keyboard, they still won't have that much articulation to them. You also do have access to extra effects. So once again, let me go into sound and go into multi-effects. You've got more than just what you see on the macro knobs or the sends. Like, both of these devices have reverbs, delays, distortions, ways to change the filter cutoffs, both for high and low pass filters, and control the resonance. You've got envelopes that you can control on both devices, and you can control a sample's start and length and its tuning. That is available on both devices. But you also gain additional effects on the MC-101, and these apply on a track-by-track basis. So in addition to your standard stuff, you also have things like phasers and choruses and auto pans and a bunch of stuff to work with. Not all of it's that great, but a lot of it's very good. And this does expand the sonic capabilities of the MC-101 quite a bit. You can put stuff through, say, a Juno chorus or an amp simulator. That's really cool to have, and that's something that the Circuit Rhythm just isn't quite set up to do. You can absolutely mangle your sound quite a bit, but you just have more options on the MC-101. It's set up to be a little bit more DAW-like than the Rhythm. And that's where workflow comes back in, because so far it seems like I'm giving the MC-101 way more credit than I'm giving to the Circuit Rhythm. And in terms of the kind of internal tech, maybe I am. When I first tried out the Circuit Rhythm and found out that it collapses samples down to mono and all the tracks are monophonic, I did go, the MC-101 has had better sampling tech and it's not that much more expensive and it came out first. What gives? But as I've used the Circuit Rhythm, I've come to find that some of those limitations aren't really a huge deal because this thing is so inspiring to use and so much fun to use that I can forgive it some of its technical limitations. And for the MC-101, it's so powerful that I can forgive some of its workflow jankiness. It's a trade-off for both devices when it comes to dealing with samples and dealing with workflow. That's what you sign yourself up for. There are a couple more aspects of Sound Engine where each of these devices have strengths and weaknesses that I want to get into, though. On the MC-101, of course, it's not only sample-based. It also has a whole ass synth engine built into it. And it's a good synth engine. It can sound quite vintage and classic, if that makes sense, but it can also sound quite clean and modern. So I've pulled up a preset. Got some kind of classic string type sounds. From the maker of a bunch of classic synths, and some stuff that can sound quite modern as well. Whereas the Circuit Rhythm doesn't have a synth engine at all. The Circuit Tracks does, but this isn't set up for that. That's not the intent. The intent is for this to be a full-blown sampler all the time. That's just a decision that was made. That's what we get. So that's a major advantage that the MC-101 has if you really want to make stuff that is both synth and sample bass. This thing has a very powerful synth engine hiding in a very small interface. And to access it fully, you do have to pay for the plugin that you use to edit synth patches much more in depth and build patches from scratch. But you can control quite a few aspects of these patches just on the MC-101, and you've got a lot of presets to work with. And you've got the random patch generator, which is not that random, but it's fun. However, let's talk about the other sound engine aspect that I wanted to get into. Chopping samples on the MC-101 is a tremendous pain in the ass. It's technically possible, but I now just probably won't do it because the sample chopping capabilities of the Circuit Rhythm are so much better. I did do a dedicated video on how to chop samples on the MC-101, so I'm not going to rehash too much of it here. But to just give you a taste of what it's like, you have to make a kit track, and then you select a sample. In this case, it would be like an entire loop or something that you want to chop up. You wait for that to import, and then you choose the section of it that you want to keep. But you have to load that same sample individually into every single pad. I have tried copying pads over, and it causes pads to mirror each other in ways that I don't want. And it's really weird, and I've had other people in my comments try it and report the same thing. Then you have to go through the extra steps of setting up a mute group, and then setting your sample start and end points completely by ear. And to be fair, you do have to do it by ear on the Circuit Rhythm as well, but there's a massive shortcut to actually chopping up samples. Whereas on here, you have to like dial in your start and end points manually and just trial and error it until you find the points that you want. Once again, it's fully possible to chop samples on the MC-101 and to do it well, and I have done it on multiple occasions, and this was one of the first in the new wave of super portable devices that were even capable of it. So I want to give the MC-101 credit there. But sample chopping on the Circuit Rhythm is much better. I've showed this before on the channel, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but let me just pull up a sample. Change how it behaves. So go to slice, select the number of slices, go to note, expand that, and now I can just set the sample points in real time, like this. So now, see that one, I don't like where I started it, so let me change the start point. if I was to do something like pitch this way down, that's super instantaneous, which is really nice to have. And you can have samples overlap with each other, which you can on both devices, but the Circuit Rhythm is set up from the ground up to be really fast for chopping samples. And since it's so intuitive for chopping samples, you're probably likely to do a much better job of it on this because it gives you all the tools that you need really immediately. One other major sampling advantage that the circuit has over the MC-101 is the fact that it actually has built-in line inputs. So you can record sounds directly into your circuit rhythm, whether it's your synths, your vinyl, your computer or phone, whatever you want. It's super straightforward to do. It's set up really well for that. And the thing is, it's capable of it. The MC-101 is not capable of that, unfortunately. It can record sounds into itself, but you have to do it through the USB port, and that will require some workarounds. You can't just use a guitar cable to plug something into this to record into it. So usually you're going to be loading sounds in via the SD card, at least that's the case for me because it's much easier. And that brings me to another technical difference in how these things handle sounds. On the MC-101, you just drag sounds onto the SD card and then you access them all through the screen. And the amount of samples you can hold is limited by the size of your SD card. That's kind of the case on the Circuit Rhythm. You can put in a micro SD card and expand the sample memory, but you have to partition sounds out into packs, and each pack has a frustratingly short amount of sample time. So if you're trying to build up a big versatile pack full of drums and synths in a bunch of different styles and some long samples for you to chop up, you probably can't. You're probably going to have to pick and choose a bit. So maybe you have a pack full of one-shots that is really versatile for building up stuff, and then have a pack that's a bit more stripped back in terms of one-shots, and then you'll have more room for some longer samples to chop up. And you kind of have to make that trade-off. Once again, you can load multiple packs into this thing, and so you still got quite a bit of versatility, but these just have different approaches to containing samples. One sample recording thing that these devices both have, though, is resampling. You can essentially get either device to record itself, and then you can do stuff like flip that sample, or in the case of the MC-101, use it to gain more layers, essentially. Because then you can bring those samples into a drum kit. You can have an entire loop just living on a pad in a drum kit on the MC-101 and use that to build up a ton of layers all hiding on one track, essentially, by resampling itself. On the Circuit Rhythm, if you were to resample stuff, it's probably going to be a bit shorter, but then you could do stuff like chop it up and flip your own samples that you just built, and maybe even have a few iterations of that to create an increasingly Inception-like collection of self-remixes, which is pretty cool. These both can do resampling, and that's really cool that such small, compact devices can do that. But next up, let's get a bit more into building up full tracks, because these do have slightly different approaches. Both have the ability to launch patterns, so you can do live jamming, and both of these have the ability to organize those patterns into collections of patterns that you can chain together. Both of these devices can do that. However, on the Circuit Rhythm, there's one more layer, and this is the case on all the circuits where you can switch between entire projects. And it automatically tempo matches them, because ordinarily that's quite a bit slower. So you can build up entire live sets on the Circuit Rhythm, and that is not the case on the MC-101. You can absolutely build up entire songs and even very complex songs, or like a mini set, but you can't switch between entire songs on the MC-101. You have to actually go in and load up songs individually. So you can use either of these devices for live performance, but I would tend to go for the Circuit Rhythm for that because it's a bit more flexible in the way that it builds up live sets. And once again, you can do a bit more DJing on the Rhythm than you can on the MC-101. But let's say that you want to do stuff in the studio with one of these devices rather than explicitly live performance. The Circuit Rhythm has its stereo outputs, and it has sidechain on each individual track. And of course, both these devices have their built-in mixing functionalities, so you can dial a mix in pretty well on both devices. The MC-101 does not have sidechain, which is really unfortunate, but what it does have is the ability to record multitrack audio over USB. So you plug this into your computer, do an entire live jam, and then you can mix and master that after the fact, which is awesome. It gives you the immediacy of a live jam and the ability to even make a video out of that, because it's like a built-in music video implicit in doing a live jam on camera, but you still get all the polish of working in a DAW afterwards, which is absolutely fantastic. Whereas with the Circuit Rhythm, it's record the outputs or nothing. That's all you get. And you can still get that to sound pretty good, but the hybrid workflow really works for me. In order to get separate tracks on the Circuit Rhythm, you'd have to play what you've got and then mute and unmute tracks as you go, which takes some extra time and is not at all conducive to live performance. So you kind of have to pick and choose with the Circuit Rhythm. Either you do live performance or you mute and unmute tracks to get all the individual stems. With the MC-101, you don't have to make that choice. You can do both, which is really cool. And I would love to see more devices, including a Circuit Pro, should such a thing ever exist, implement that. I mentioned I would get back into scatter effects. Another function of the MC-101 liking to deal with individual tracks is the fact that you can route the scatter effects to affect only one track. So for instance, there's like a tape stop effect in here, and I want that to be only on one synth because it would be kind of disruptive on the entire mix. I can route it so that it will only affect that one track. Not the case on the Circuit Rhythm. Every single grid effect affects the entire mix, and there is nothing you can do to change it, at least at the time that I'm recording this. Hopefully by now you can see that these devices have some pretty different approaches and both make trade-offs to get the objectives that the designers wanted. The MC-101, in a lot of ways, is quite a bit deeper. Of course, it's got an entire synth engine in here, which the Rhythm does not, and it handles samples a little more cleanly and can turn them effectively into synths. The Rhythm, on the other hand, sacrifices some of that to have the blazing fast screenless workflow, and it chops samples much better than the MC-101 probably ever will. And you can record samples directly into the Circuit Rhythm, cannot on the MC-101. The MC-101 gives you a cleaner sound because of the multi-track audio, but it's probably not as good for live sets because you can't switch between projects, whereas the Rhythm can do that. So you've got quite a bit to consider here, but overall, I would say for live purposes or for some sample chopping based beat making, I would give the win to the Circuit Rhythm. For more polished in the studio stuff, I would definitely give that to the MC-101. I've said before in videos that if I had to completely start my gear collection over from scratch and could only own one thing for an extended period of time, I would make it the MC-101 because there is so much power in such a portable device. So it's really easy for me to recommend. And like I said, the interface has gotten a lot better. The Circuit Rhythm has put that into some doubt because the Circuit Rhythm is some of the most fun I've had making music in a while. And that does put a bit of conflict into that assertion that the MC-101 is the clear choice. I think I would probably still go with the MC-101 because it's got a cleaner sound. It interfaces with the DAW more cleanly. Overall, I could make more professional sounding stuff with the MC-101. But if I leaned a bit more towards sample chopping or just wanted to have more fun making music and be a bit more inspired or do like entire live sets, once again, I would go with the Circuit Rhythm. So for me, it's kind of a toss-up. I'm glad that I don't have to make that call, but they do have different strengths and different weaknesses, different limitations, and different features. So hopefully this video gives you an idea of which one you might lean a bit more towards based on what you want out of a portable music production setup. If you'd like to see my individual reviews of both devices, you can click or tap up over here somewhere. And if you'd like to see the Novation Circuit Rhythm go up against a much higher priced device, the MPC-1, you can click or tap down over here for the video I did last week. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.